Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I'm Matt Schultz with the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. It's no secret that climate change is wreaking havoc on our natural cycles, and that includes our phosphorus cycle. One manifestation of this is seen in the warming of snow-covered regions, which has led to snow melting, soil warming, and more rain on snow flooding, among other changes. These changes affect how nutrients such as phosphorus are conveyed across landscapes to receiving waters. We can no longer take for granted that winter transport of nutrients is relatively low. A new environmental research paper entitled Winter Runoff Events Pose an Unquantified Continental-scale Risk of High Wintertime Nutrient Export issues a clarion call for researchers to focus more attention on how changes in wintertime nutrient transport might affect water quality across the country. I'm joined today by two of that report's authors, Drs. Adair and Andrew Schroth of the University of Vermont. Thank you both for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. Can you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Sure. I am an associate professor at the University of Vermont at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, and I'm an ecosystem ecologist and like to study nutrients and carbon.
Great. And Andrew?
My name is Andrew Schroth. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Geosciences at the University of Vermont, and I've done a lot of work studying nutrient export in watersheds using sensors.
Great. I thought this was a really important paper, so I'm really glad you're able to join us. If you could just go ahead and walk us through your presentation, that would be great.
Sure. Well, as you explained, we have the title page of the article here, looking at how winter runoff events are posing this unquantified risk of nutrient export. And this was the result of a lot of people's work. You can see all of us here. Everyone put in a bunch of work, and we had some great support from different sponsors. So Andrew and I are here to talk about it today, but there were a lot of people working along with us on this.
Team effort. Thanks.
Yes. So the take home of the paper is really that nearly half of the US is creating this wintertime pollution when it rains and snow melts, but we're not doing a great job of keeping track of how much, where it's going, or what its impact on water quality downstream are. And we started really thinking about this by looking at how winter is changing in Vermont and indeed across the country. So our old winters in the northern US, we used to have these really long, cold winters with a lot of snowpack that kept nutrients sort of locked up in soils and stream flows really low. But now we're having these frequent snow melt and even rain events, rain on snow events, kind of washing soils and nutrients downstream and runoff and floodwaters. And these are both pictures that folks that we work with have taken. So it's happening around us every day. Not every day, but a lot of days. And one example of this was the March 2019 rain on snow flooding event in the Midwestern US. This is showing you sort of normal conditions. And then this is the flood condition during that event. So was a really intense rainstorm that brought downpours with this unusually warm air into the Midwest. And it really rapidly melted a bunch of snow and ice, producing this really dramatic and sort of economically and environmentally devastating flood in this really short period of time. And when we checked out the data, so these figures are showing you cumulative winter discharge over time. And when we looked at the data for the lower Missouri River and upper Mississippi River watersheds, which are two watersheds that were really dramatically impacted by this rain on snow flood event, winter discharge has nearly doubled since 1929. So that's a pretty big change. And we expect that along with all of this water, there's a lot of nutrient and soil going downstream that likely have water quality impacts. And I'm going to let Andrew talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, the water quality impacts of these events are kind of particularly understudied, in part because they're very difficult to monitor. But They could impact things like cyanobacteria blooms in subsequent summers, the occurrence of dead zones in the case of the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, and obviously our capacity to meet water quality targets such as TMDLs. So we can look at a little bit of the data from some of these events to kind of infer what are some of the water quality impacts of these midwinter thaw events. Next. But first, why do we not have a lot of data in capturing these events and understanding their impact on water quality? And the answer to that is because winter fieldwork is particularly challenging, especially in these refreezing and thawing river systems where the work is inherently dangerous, our equipment is compromised, and even getting to the sites can be challenging due to the weather conditions and the rapidly changing water levels. So with that, here's some of the data from our focal site in the paper, the Mississippi. So the Mississippi River, and then upstream in the lower Missouri River. What we're looking at here is turbidity, so a proxy for the sediment that's in the storm event, and then discharge on the x-axis. And what these black dots are showing, which are the actual rain on snow event that we studied in our paper, was that these particular events were disproportionately enriched in sediment. So very high sediment loads relative to water. That's why those black lines are near the top of the entire monitoring data set, which is shown in gray. And of course, if our audience is interested in phosphorus often tracks these high sediment loads. So these events are likely particularly enriched in particulate-bound phosphorus. We can also look at dissolved phosphorus in some of the systems that we've been studying in Vermont. And here you can see this is actual sensor data from an agricultural and a forested system in Vermont. And what you can see is that we're collecting data from both the winter and the entire growing season, so the non-winter season. And we found that in Hungerford, we're talking about total dissolved phosphorus that almost half of it is coming out during that winter period where we typically thought of, in the past, as Carol discussed, a not particularly active biogeochemical time period. Interestingly, here we also see a dramatic difference between how much of this is coming out in our forested site during winter, so 12% of our total dissolved phosphorus load rather than 46% in our Hungerford data set. So there's definitely a land use control here as well that impacts how much of the phosphorus is coming out during these winter events. And this is unpublished data that we're actively working on with some of our currently funded projects, particularly exploring this land use control. And so we have some ideas on why these winter events might be unique.
Yeah, and why they might be carrying more nutrients in soil than similar events during the growing season. And there's a few reasons or some ideas that we have as to why this might be the case. And one is that plants are dormant, right? Trees drop their leaves. Plants typically aren't taking up water and nutrients as they are during the growing season. And this can actually have a really large impact on what ends up going downstream. We've also got potentially bare soils that are freezing and thawing. So these freeze-thaw cycles sort of loosen up soil and can cause erosion, particularly of stream banks. And then we've also got bare or low cover soils, perhaps in agricultural areas that might be really vulnerable to runoff if there's not snowpack and snow cover at the time. So again, going back to our main take-home point that nearly half of the US is potentially creating this winter pollution. And this is the main figure from our paper showing that risk of nutrient export with rain on snow events. There's a lot going on in this figure. The red areas are sort of the highest risk areas, and orange sort of less so, moving down to green. So I'm going to unpack this just a little bit to show you how we created this figure and what data went into it. So first we have the frequency of large rain on snow events. So in this case, we've got very high frequency events, or very high frequency being up to 36 times a year. And for our figure, we used rain on snow events that might be happening at least once every 4 years. So on this scale, that's 0.25 events per year. So the green up. or the green through the black areas. So I think one of the cool things about this figure is that it shows you just kind of how common these large rain on snow events are. So we move from once every 4 years across a large swath of the country to up to 36 times a year. That's a lot. So we took this information about large rain on snow events and combined it with a whole bunch of information about what areas of the US might be nutrient rich. And we used nitrogen and phosphorus data to look at sort of the richness of areas in terms of nutrients. So these are our inputs for nitrogen. We used nitrogen in the topsoil, and we combined that with nitrogen coming into the system from wet deposition, as well as nitrogen that we add by fertilization through either chemical fertilizers or manure.
And
So
Carol, can you just, I'm sorry, very quickly,
Sure.
can you just, for people who might not know, can you explain what "and from wet deposition" means exactly?
Sure. So that is just coming down in rain, basically. So a lot of it is coming from fossil fuel combustion. So we burn coal, for example, and that releases nitrogen oxides that when it combines with water, it creates nitric oxide that
Great.
gets deposited onto the surface. So
Thank you.
it's can be a big input in certain areas, as you can see in that upper right map. All right. So for phosphorus, we have a similar sort of set of input maps. We used phosphorus in the topsoil. There are no atmospheric inputs of phosphorus that are really substantial. So we then just focused on inputs from fertilizers and from manure. So then we combined all of this information, sort of overlaid the rain on snow map on top of all of this information about how nutrient rich an area might be to come up with this map of what are the risks of overlapping rain on snow and nutrient rich areas to nutrient export. And what we found was about 50% of US nitrogen and phosphorus stocks are at risk of export during these rain on snow events. But as we said earlier, because it's so hard to do monitoring in winter, we know very little about how much is actually going downstream, as well as what the downstream impacts are. But our hope is that we can use this map, at least as a starting place, to start thinking about where do we want to monitor, where do we need to know really what's going downstream, and then ultimately, can we target some of these areas to improve water quality? Because we have a better chance at improving water quality if we know where and when to target.
Yeah, so I guess just in closing, I think a lot of what we hope our paper does is kind of trigger a call to arms across the monitoring community, the policy community, and the scientific community that we need to start looking at these events in a greater detail in our monitoring programs, in our water quality policy and targets, and in the research that we're conducting, so that we can start to get a better handle on how these changing winters are ultimately going to impact water quality across the country and potentially the globe.
Yeah, you've really thrown down the gauntlet here, and I think there's a lot of research that has to follow up on this, right? I mean, almost every paper ends with, more research is needed, but and that can sometimes sound self-serving, but here it really is, right? There's a lot that needs to be done, and it's disheartening to see Iowa especially being hit by this, given the exports that are happening on the Mississippi already. I think one question I might have for you is, do you have any thoughts on how conservation practices might have to adapt on farm to address these challenges?
Yeah, I actually think we already know how to do a lot of things that would be really helpful in these situations. And in fact, a lot of people already are doing them. So things like winter cover crops, I think, would be quite good. Keeping our soil and our nutrients in place where we want them, right? We don't want all this stuff to wash downstream. It's counterproductive. As well as, buffer zones. And I think that, we're I feel like the communities are working pretty hard to implement both of these sorts of practices, but that more would help more.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wondered about cover crops specifically because the freezing thaw cycles tend to release a lot of phosphorus, from what I understand. And yeah, anyway, that's maybe a topic for another paper, another conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly with the freezing and thawing, if you have ground cover or any sort of substantive ground cover, you can prevent at least some of it from happening.
I see. Yeah.
At least to the extreme, anyway.
I was just going to add one other thing is that I think, something at least that I know happens in kind of our part of the country is because there's a winter manure ban for applying manure during the winter, there's an awful lot of manure that goes on our fields after the crops have been harvested, but before that winter manure ban takes place. And thus there's potentially a lot of labile phosphorus and nitrogen, of course, that's on top of a field that's going to freeze, that doesn't have a lot of biological uptake. And then when it gets hit with these winter thaws, you can get some very high concentrations of manure-derived nutrients coming out of some of these systems because of that kind of late fall practice. So moving away from that, I think, if possible, would be a good thing.
Great. Well, I really appreciate this. Go ahead. Sorry, Andrew.
The other thing I thought was worth mentioning was coming back kind of to our call to arms to the scientific and the monitoring community is that, as our technology improves and there's less reliance on us going out into the field to collect samples rather than using things like drones, using things like satellite data, using things like sensors that you can stick in the stream for the entire winter, there's an increasing capacity to study these events without encountering at least the same set of challenges that we do when we're trying to target them with someone running out to grab a water sample when there's, very dangerous conditions along the river.
Right.
So hopefully we can improve in the long term by changing some of the way that we monitor these kind of events.
Great. I appreciate that comment. And I really appreciate the work you've done here and also the time you've taken in putting this presentation together. So I want to thank you both for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now.
Thank you.
Thank you.